Okay. I mean, again, you know, the integrity is just a tool. But the stuff for your final exam will begin with the stuff we went over on Descartes. Remember, there's separate PowerPoints for Descartes, for empiricism, for Hume on the self, which is connected with empiricism, and for utilitarianism. You know, so basically I will spend some time Monday going over the question pool, but I've done as much as I'm going to do on utilitarianism. There's stuff at the end on objections to utilitarianism that we're not going to worry about, and there's stuff at the end of that PowerPoint on the distinction between two types of utilitarianism, act and rule. We're not going to worry about that, okay? That PowerPoint I use sometimes for business ethics or for separate ethics classes where we go into this stuff in more detail than we do in intro, you know, so. Well, we saw that Descartes was doing the kind of thing that Plato suggested the cave dwellers ought to do in the allegory of the cave, and that is go through his current beliefs. But Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, did not care for philosophy as much as he did for mathematics, because what he did not like about philosophy that he liked about mathematics is in mathematics, things seemed to be settled. People weren't engaged in endless debates over whether the basic principles of, say, plane geometry, the kind of geometry you took in high school, if you took any geometry at all, whether those basic principles were good. There was no debate. Things were settled in mathematics, but they weren't in philosophy. And so Descartes thinks what we need is to clear away the dead wood. That is, he needs to go through and try to get out of philosophy some questionable assumptions. And then he also wants to rebuild philosophical knowledge and by implication scientific knowledge on the same kind of absolute basis that you get in something like a system of geometry, where the whole system is built on a few absolutely certain, self-evidently true principles. This is what he wants to do for philosophy. And so that's what needs to be done to put philosophy and science on firm ground. So he takes geometry as his model, and geometry is a system built on a few certain truths. So he thinks if he can do the same thing for philosophic knowledge and for scientific knowledge, then knowledge in those areas is going to be as settled and beyond debate as it is in, or was, for mathematics. And as a rationalist, Descartes also, he's looking for a very high degree of certainty in our knowledge. And so he wants to reconstruct knowledge on absolutely certain foundations. Now he fails at this. We already saw it, that his whole program is circular and it relies on abstract innate ideas. But this was what he was trying to do. So the way he's going to treat his current beliefs, he knows that it's hard to prove anything false. And in order to sort of set aside a belief, he knows that he doesn't have to prove something false, but just raise a doubt about it. And his method gets several names. I put them on the blackboard. You can go look at that in your notes. The one that's used most often is methodic doubt, but also methodological skepticism and hyperbolic doubt. Hyperbolic doubt is very suggestive of the fact that this is a technical method of proceeding. In Descartes' everyday life, he doesn't have any more doubt about whether he really exists, whether he's in a real room full of real things like his easy chair and the paper he's writing on. But philosophically, he thinks he can raise a hyperbolic doubt, an unusual doubt about these things. And we saw that he does this in two ways. One, he raises a doubt about the knowledge that we seem to have from our senses by conjecturing that he might be dreaming. He knows our senses can deceive us in things like optical illusions. Even in Descartes' day, they knew about the old bent stick and water illusion. He makes the point that something that's far away or distant or very small, our senses can trick us, but we seem, on the face of it, to have certain knowledge about what we immediately perceive going on around us. I mean, none of us doubts that we're in a real room here with real other people, seated on real, chairs with real desks and books in front of us, right? And we seem to have a certain knowledge of that, of what we immediately perceive in the room around us, as we do, say, that of a mathematical principle, like 2 + 2 = 4, or the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But Descartes calls the knowledge we seem to have by our senses into doubt by raising this conjecture that he might be dreaming it all. And so this calls into question the principle that we can trust what our senses tell us. So the dream conjecture supposedly raises a doubt about what we even perceive clearly and think our senses tell us is absolutely true knowledge, because Descartes says, well, even in a dream, things seem vivid, and yet he says, I've awakened from a dream and found that I was in my bed when I thought I might have been sitting here in my study. And so why not conjecture that we're dreaming all the time? And of course, this was the point of showing the video on the Matrix, that that if what we immediately are aware of is our own inner mental life, there's a question about whether we're producing what we think what we think is caused by stuff outside of us. And Hume takes this to the nth degree, and he says, well, if all we are acquainted with is our perceptions, there's no certainty that those perceptions are caused by something outside of us. by real material objects in a real world. So Hume says we ought to be skeptical about the claim that we know there's a real material world out there. But here Descartes raises this issue, and obviously there's no software in Descartes' day, but he says maybe my mind is creating what I think is a real world. How do I know I'm not dreaming now? And of course this raises a doubt about the things we perceive because he says we can't tell the difference. There's no absolute test we can use to tell the difference between whether we're dreaming or whether we're awake. And so if that's the case, then he can at least raise a doubt about the things he even perceives very clearly and that seem to be so certain from our senses. So he says there aren't any tests to distinguish waking from sleeping. Science says the dream conjecture makes doubtful. Well, even in Descartes' day, there were rudimentary forms of chemistry, biology, astronomy around. And so Descartes' conjecture that we might not be able to trust what our senses are telling us extends to any of the sciences that are based on observations or observations extended by equipment like telescopes and microscopes. So these are the sciences that are made doubtful by the dream conjecture. So now Descartes is convinced, though, that this conjecture that we might be in a dream, while it enables him to raise a hypothetical, a theoretical doubt about the knowledge he seems to have based on what his senses tell him, he says, I can't use this same argument to raise a doubt about mathematical truths, like a square has 4 equal sides, or 2 plus 3 equals 5 was this. And why not? Well, Descartes is convinced that even in a dream, even if we're talking about a square that isn't real because it's a square that we're looking at in our dream, the square is still going to have 4 sides. 2 plus 3 is still going to equal 5, even in a dream. So here's where Descartes really goes out on a limb. And to question mathematics, he says, well, you can mess up doing a mathematical proof. And what if there were some evil entity? Now he can't because of God's goodness and also because he needs God to bail him out. He doesn't want to conjecture that maybe God is messing him up. That'll get him in more trouble with the church than he's already in. Remember, he lived most of his life in Holland because he was because of persecution from the Catholic Church back in France. So he conjectures that maybe some evil, he calls it an evil genius, but it's more like a demonic creature, is messing him up even in his beliefs about mathematics. Now this you really have to go out on a limb for. But as I say, to make Descartes more believable here, if you think about the times when you have made a mistake along the way doing some kind of a math problem and you didn't get the right answer, right? well, imagine that there's some evil entity whispering in your ear, messing you up every time you take a math test. And some of you are saying, well, doggone, I bet you that's what it was. That's why I got that C in math. You know, I have an evil demon attacking me. In other words, if you imagine something like that, I think Descartes becomes a little more believable in his claim that if there were such an evil entity, it could mess him up in his beliefs about math. So he says, basically, you combine these two ways of doubting knowledge, and you can doubt the reality of the world around you, the reality of other people, whether God's around. You can also doubt even the reliability of mathematics. You can doubt what your senses tell you about a real world. He says practically everything I think I know could be thrown into doubt if I bring in this conjecture about some evil entity. And again, Descartes is not trying to end up in skepticism, but he's basically, if he can raise these theoretical doubts, then he knows that the beliefs he can raise the doubts about are not going to be the certain foundation he's looking for. He's looking for a belief that survives this. So the belief that survives both conjectures is what? Well, he says, if a demon's deceiving me about everything else, the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm here to be deceived. Or if I am doubting all of my other beliefs, the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm here to do the doubting. And so Descartes takes the certainty of his own existence as the foundational principle of his whole philosophy. And in the Meditations, he says, I'm going to take the principle I exist as true every time I conceive of it. The way he says it in another book, the Discourse on Method, is the way you and I have heard it before we ever took a philosophy class. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So, and the essential properties then of an immaterial soul are thought. He says, what am I essentially? I'm a thinking thing, a being that has thoughts. And what he means by thinking is that various mental operations occur, affirming something, denying something, perceiving something, remembering something. This is how he... but for Descartes, he is essentially an immortal soul. And for Descartes, souls are not located in Newtonian space. They're like mathematical points. This is an argument that goes all the way back to Socrates and the Greeks. In other words, how is it that you can fit an infinite number of mathematical points on, say, this line? Well, it's because the points theoretically have no width to them. So you can squeeze an infinite number of them around. Thank you for interrupting our class consistently. And so the point is, Descartes takes souls that have no extension in Newtonian space, no width, but thought is their main property. So Descartes did more than any other philosopher to try to distinguish immaterial substance from material substance. The main properties of matter, and we see Locke expanding on these, are basically location and extension in space. Well, of course, this raises for him mind-body problems. If Cartesian minds aren't even located in Newtonian space, how is it that the mind can influence the body, or something that happens with the body can have an impact on the mind? If they're not, in other words, things need to be close to one another to causally interact. As I said when I discussed this in the PowerPoint, if I turn on the gas stove but set my tea kettle across the room, the gas stove isn't going to cause the water in the tea kettle to boil, right? The cue ball needs to contact the 8-ball in order for the 8-ball to move. You know, causes and effects need to have this relationship in space, and yet Cartesian minds aren't located in space. So Descartes tries to solve this problem in a way that practically nobody thinks is legitimate. He conjectures that a gland at the base of the brain, the pineal gland, is the place where body and mind interact. That it's of such subtle matter that even the immaterial mind can influence the pineal gland, and through the pineal gland influence the rest of the body. Well, there's absolutely no observational evidence that that's the function of the pineal gland, so Descartes doesn't have that in support. Plus, he really just pushes the problem back a level. He's got as much of a problem explaining how the immaterial mind can move the pineal gland as a material thing as he does in explaining how it can move the rest of the body. But even down to this day, you know, this is a problem raised by anybody who wants to hold a dualistic theory of mind. You know, how then is their mind-body interaction? You know, so, well, we have, you know, we'll continue doing review with Locke next time, although the first thing I will do Monday is give you out the printout of the take-home essay questions. So again, your test a week from Monday. And I'm going to send the review sheet to the printer today, and hopefully we get that back. But the review sheet, what I'm going over now, is on Blackboard for you, so you can look at that. But we'll sort of pick up review with John Locke and the British empiricists next time. You know, and remember, there are integrity files associated with all of the PowerPoints as well. You know, so. Okay, I called the roll. If you came in after I called the roll, let me know, and we'll see you Monday